Welcome everybody. It is very nice and very good to see you here today. Thank you for coming. It is now 5:07 in Crete and Alexandria, and 5:09 in the morning in California. So I think we'd better begin. So please keep your microphones off during the talk. You will be able to turn them on for the discussion. This is the inaugural event of the Between Athens and Alexandria research project. And we are very happy and honored that our first speaker is Professor Edward J. Watts from the University of California at San Diego. And we warmly thank him for having accepted the invitation. Before introducing our speaker, I would just like to thank the Bibliotheca Alexandrina and especially the Center for Hellenistic Studies and its director, Emad Halil, Professor of Maritime Archaeology, for welcoming me and, in a way, us Neoplatonic community back to Alexandria. Alexandria is our alma mater as Neoplatonic scholars, so we are thrilled to be back. And in fact, in a way, the project is meant to honor the 20th anniversary of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina in October 2022. Yet, the return to Alexandria wouldn't have been possible without the Institute for Mediterranean Studies, which is based here in Rethymno, and which is one of the institutes of the Foundation for Research and Technology, ELAS, and without its director, Gelina Harlaftis, Professor of Maritime History at the University of Crete, who is here with us today, and who has enthusiastically embraced the idea of a collaboration with the Library of Alexandria on Neoplatonism. Nor would this return be possible without the support of the Onassis Foundation. So it is thanks to the Onassis Foundation and the Institute for Mediterranean Studies that we have been able to set sail for Alexandria, for which I cannot thank them enough. Many thanks to many colleagues and friends for ideas, support, and advice, and to you all. As I said, Professor Harlaftis, the director of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies, is here with us today. And I think she would like to address the welcome word. So, Gelina.
Thank you, Rini. Welcome everybody to the virtual lecture hall of IMS. We have a beautiful lecture room, which was a Venetian church, and hopefully you'll be here to see it and visit us. This is really, the idea and the whole plan was scheduled, was formed, was executed by Irini. Professor Viltagnotti came to my office with all these lovely ideas, and we're extremely happy to have philosophy now in our institute. Our institute is part of the main research center of Greece, and it has 8 institutes. It's mainly science, computer science, laser, and so on. We are the only Institute of Humanities, and we are history and culture. We have about 39 research projects and 4 ERC projects. And we did not have philosophy until now. So we are thrilled that Irini opens up to philosophy here. And so welcome from me to this online lecture series on late antique Neoplatonism. And that takes place within the research project that Irene was able to finance and we to host between Athens and Alexandria. I'll be very happy to follow your lectures. So here's to you again, Irene.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jelena. So I think now it is time to introduce our speaker. Although I doubt he needs any introduction, but still. So Edward Watts is Alcibiades Vasiliadis Endowed Chair and Professor of History at the University of California at San Diego. He holds a PhD from Yale University, and his research focuses mainly on late antique and early Byzantine intellectual, social, and religious history. And his books include City and School in Late Antique Athens and Alexandria, Riot in Alexandria, Historical Debate in Pagan and Christian Communities, The Final Pagan Generation, Hypatia or Hypatia, The Life and Legend of an Ancient Philosopher, and Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny. His most recent book is The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome by Oxford University Press in 2021. And today he is going to talk on The Friend, The Eccentric, and the Jerk. How much did the personalities of philosophers shape the fate of Alexandrian and Athenian teaching? So Ed, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Irene, and thank you, Galina, and thank you everyone for organizing this. I am really deeply honored, and I have to say I'm extremely humbled to see all of the faces and names of people who are attending this. So I apologize in advance that this is something of an experiment. What I'm trying to do is get into a challenge that I've really been exploring for the better part of now almost 25 years. And this is the challenge of discerning the relative impacts of the ideas and actions of ancient philosophers. Because for many of us, the ideas of these thinkers stand alone in an almost disembodied fashion. And the physicality of philosophers, their personalities, and even their intellectual development over time can often get distilled into a portrait of a systematic set of doctrines, interpretations, ideas, and approaches. And this is especially true for philosophers who are less well attested. In those cases, a philosopher's thought, and often only the surviving written evidence of his or her thought, can completely overshadow the thinker and can completely overshadow the personality of the individual and the actual sort of reality of that person as they develop over time. And this is natural in a field that focuses on ideas. But this approach also seduces us with its simplicity, because the philosophy we study is above all the product of human beings who learn, evolve, and respond to the challenges of the world around them. And so there are two tasks, in a sense, that the historian of philosophy has to undertake. One is the history of ideas. And in that sense, when we're exploring ideas, seeing them as the product of a kind of integrated mind and the product of an evolutionary process in someone's thinking is perfectly fine. But when we're talking about the philosophers, it's a bit of a different challenge, because those are people. And as historical figures, as humans, they evolve and they change over time. And so what I wanted to try to do today is to consider how we might recapture some of the dynamic interactions between the personalities of ancient philosophers, the responses their contemporaries had to their personalities, and the manner in which those responses affected philosophers' teaching, and ultimately the legacy that these philosophers have in the modern world and also in the ancient world. And the very basic question I'll explore is this: how much did it matter if a philosopher could play well with others? This is admittedly quite preliminary. And what I am working with, and I'll be the first to admit, the challenge we're working with is our texts generally do not want to answer this question. Our texts, especially for late Platonism, tend to be commentaries that speak very little about the personality of individuals, because that's frankly not what the text is about. But I think what this study will show is that philosophers who antagonized others can be found in the sources that we have. And we can see that they faced greater challenges to their ideas and activities than philosophers who could get along with their fellow citizens. And the problems that ordinary philosophers caused for themselves probably did help shape the history of Athenian and Alexandrian Neoplatonism, as well as the shape of philosophy that comes out of late antiquity and into our world. And so I think we can start with the pretty easily proven point that some ancient philosophers could be jerks. The breaking apart of Plato's academy following the death of Speusippus, for example, happened in large part because Aristotle, and especially Heraclides of Pontus, behaved obnoxiously towards Plato and towards some of Plato's followers. So one of the classic texts describing this is this text from Aelian that tells us how an elderly Plato stopped leaving his house because Aristotle would subject him to harsh and unjust questions whenever Plato ventured out in public. And this continued until Xenocrates, Plato's disciple, drove Aristotle out of the public space so that Plato could again leave his house and resume teaching without harassment. Now, the popularity that Xenocrates enjoyed and the polarization that Aristotle's actions caused had implications for the future of Platonism. Because when Speusippus died, the Academy famously held an election to determine the next head. And the possible successors included Aristotle, though at that moment Aristotle was not in Athens, as well as accomplished philosophers like Heraclides of Pontus and Menedemus. But Xenocrates won the election despite being an inferior thinker to his rivals. And what's interesting is the texts tell us that he won because they admired his temperance, because they admired his personality. And this contrasted greatly with Xenocrates' rival Aristotle, who was known for his ostentatious way of dressing, as well as, if we believe Aelian, his, well, not particularly pleasant behavior towards Plato later in Plato's life. Heraclides of Pontus is a sort of other order of magnitude beyond this. He contrasted so directly with Xenocrates' temperance that Heraclides came to be known as Heraclides Pompikos because of his arrogance. And so one can rightly wonder what the history of philosophy would now look like if, say, Aristotle was modest and temperate in the way that Xenocrates was. Would he have inspired the same enthusiasm among his students that Xenocrates did? I think it's possible. It's not provable, of course, because those contrafactuals are not there. But if we look forward in time, we can see that Porphyry's Life of Plotinus gives us a detailed portrait of a profound thinker who blended philosophical inspiration with an easy sociability. So Plotinus, Porphyry writes, exuded kindliness. His face looked gentle, but also intellectually rigorous when he was questioned. Anyone who wanted was allowed to attend his discussions, and he encouraged them to ask all kinds of questions. Sometimes, as when Porphyry persisted for 3 days in asking questions about the embodiment of the soul, Plotinus's willingness to answer and his patience irritated others. But Plotinus, we're told, diffused the tension by explaining that questions were essential prerequisites to the deeper study of texts. And Plotinus also always made himself available for philosophical discussions with associates until the very end of his life. And this ended only because Plotinus's final illness became so serious that he was forced to turn away followers, basically for their own protection. Now, despite the evident chaos in his seminars, Plotinus ensured that discussions remained respectful and a spirit of community and collaboration prevailed. So Porphyry describes a couple of occasions where Plotinus deftly managed situations that could have exploded into animosity. So Porphyry once read a rather strange poem that he had composed for the Feast of Plato. And it was composed in the mystical language of inspiration. And one of the other members of Plotinus's circle was bemused by this, and he exclaimed that Porphyry had gone insane. But Plotinus responded simply by saying that Porphyry had proved himself to be at once a poet, philosopher, and a priest. And this again diffused the sort of tension in this situation. At another point, a rhetorician visiting the circle used Plato's symposium to give a ghastly defense of pederasty to the group. And Plotinus was deeply offended, but we're told he refrained from leaving the gathering and instead asked Porphyry to write a counter argument after the rhetorician left. Now, Plotinus's genial and patient personality served his circle well. Although some critics charged Plotinus with treating his inner circle discussions like social gatherings, Plotinus's openness and willingness to engage others introduced a wide range of people to his ideas and led them to a deeper appreciation of his philosophical system. He had a large following, Porphyry would write, and people with a thirst for philosophy gathered around him. And these included doctors and poets and orators and quite a few Roman senators, as well as women who were devoted to philosophy. They were, Porphyry wrote, like a family. And some of his devotees even opened up their houses and properties to Plotinus, and a number of men and women of the highest social status brought their children to him when they were about to die, so that Plotinus's house was full of little boys and girls whose legal trusts he examined so that their administrators didn't misuse the money. We're told that he enjoyed a close relationship with the Emperor Gallienus and his wife Salanina, and this was a difficult thing to do in the 260s. When Roman central authority splintered, at the time that Plotinus is enjoying this relationship with Gallienus, there's of course a usurper empire in Gaul. There's also the regime of Zenobia in Palmyra. And philosophers without the social skills of Plotinus made mistakes in this context, most notably Longinus, who found himself drifting into the orbit of the court of Palmyra and ended up executed as a kind of fall guy when that court fell apart. But despite his strong ties to leading figures in Rome during this deeply unsettled political moment, Plotinus, and Porphyry says, Plotinus said that he never made a single enemy in all of his public life. So why did all of this matter? Because the devotion of Plotinus's associates ensured the success of his ideas. Plotinus was a notoriously indifferent writer whose poor spelling, lack of sentence or word breaks, dense writing style, and obscure manner of expression combined with a total unwillingness to edit his own philosophical works. His works survive now entirely because of the devotion of his followers, Aemilius and particularly Porphyry. But Porphyry explains that the editorial process wasn't just him and Aemilius, but it was also something that involved undertakings by his other associates too. And this included taking notes for some texts, not systematically, but when associates asked for something written down to help them understand a point. And so this editing and publication project was a family affair that involved all of Plotinus's philosophical devotees and was done for their mutual benefit. And so the community of enthusiastic and influential followers that Plotinus established, this nourished and superintended his legacy. Now, an interesting counterpoint to this is Maximus of Ephesus. Both Plotinus and Maximus were inspirational teachers who enjoyed ready access to senators and close relationships with emperors. But the two men had radically different personalities. Maximus was an intense figure whose energy, his biographer Eunapius wrote, where did that go? There we go. Whose energy struck those who conversed with him since they couldn't endure the sharp movement of his eyes or the fast track of his words. Unlike Plotinus's easygoing way of managing discussions, no one dared contradict Maximus, not even the most eloquent or experienced, but instead they yielded in silence. And when Maximus's colleagues discussed ideas in their presence, they self-censored because they avoided precision in the components of their arguments and dialectical devices, even though when Maximus was absent, they would shine out like a bright star because they feared what Maximus might do in response. And Maximus developed an arrogance that infected his interactions with other people as well. So when the Emperor Julian summoned Maximus to court, there we go. Maximus and his colleague Chrysanthus famously conducted a ritual to find out whether the gods approved of them joining the emperor. And although the omens were unfavorable, Maximus responded to them by saying that we've learned from our training that it's the duty of the most elevated Hellenes to contest violently with the nature of the divine until it would submit to all of those who serve it. And once he announced that he would join the emperor, crowds of people of all social statuses flocked to Maximus to try to take advantage of the new close relationship to power that Maximus had. But this is on a superficial level very similar to what we see with Plotinus, right? Senators, imperial officials, other people of prominence, even women flocking to the philosopher with access to contemporary power. But Plotinus built deep relationships with emperors, senators, and prominent people through a mutual interest in philosophy that his open-mindedness and kindly nature permitted to develop slowly and organically. Maximus had these connections to prominent people drop on him suddenly, and these were superficial relationships that grew out of his temporal power and not personal connections that bound teacher and student. And Maximus handled this sudden prominence extremely poorly. So we're told that Maximus hurried to Constantinople after the summons from Julian, and he did this with a great crowd of clients. And Maximus then became insolent when he was in the imperial court. We're told that he wore flowing robes of a material that was too luxurious for a philosopher, and he became more and more unapproachable. And this ended poorly for Maximus, and ultimately for the philosophical tradition that he taught. Because after Julian's death, Maximus was arrested, and the crowds who'd once flocked to him instead clamored against him, both in public and in the theaters and in private to the emperor. Maximus was fined a sum of money so large that a philosopher could hardly have heard of such an amount, and he was sent to Asia to make payment. He asked his wife to buy poison so that they could both commit suicide together. She took the poison, he did not. And then he was rescued from imprisonment by one of the few government officials who still remained friendly to him, but Maximus couldn't even take advantage of this mercy. Instead, he again ran afoul of imperial authorities, and in 471, 8 years after the death of Julian, he was executed as part of the treason trials conducted by Valens. He died without philosophical heirs, and the tradition in which he'd been trained instead lived on through the disciples of others, like his fellow student Chrysanthus, and especially a nephew of Iamblichus, who planted Iamblican Neoplatonism in Athens. Now, if we move to Athens, we can see that Proclus offers something of a middle ground between the beloved Plotinus and the abrasive Maximus. Proclus, we're told, shared Plotinus's ability to inspire devotion among his inner circle of followers. Indeed, so much devotion was inspired that his disciple Marinus wrote a biography in prose and verse that celebrated Proclus's memory 1 year after the scholar's death. But early in his career as an Athenian scholar, Proclus's interventions in Athenian public life attracted such a backlash that Maximus would certainly have understood this reaction. Marinus describes this situation kind of obliquely. He says that Proclus would converse with the leaders about just deeds, and he not only exhorted them, but in a way he forced the proper treatment of everyone by a philosophical freedom of expression. And this apparently antagonized Athenians so much that Proclus was forced, in Marinus's conception, to give a Herculean appearance of political strength, as Athenian anger forced Proclus through a tempest until he retired from certain vulture-like men and went away from Athens. Now, we're told that Proclus stayed away from Athens for about a year. And then when he returned, he changed his behavior. When Proclus came back, he understood that he needed to be more judicious about how he intervened in public life. And so when Proclus felt that circumstances prevented him from participating politically, he summoned his student and native Athenian Archaeades to this occupation. And Marinus wrote that Proclus trained Archaeades so that Archaeades could manifest the political virtues and philosophical methods, and then Proclus would guide him in the way that in the ideas that he ought to present to the Athenian assembly. And in doing this, Proclus developed in Archaeades a certain eagerness for this work that combined Proclus's philosophical direction with a softer personality to an effective degree, so that the Athenians could be guided by Proclus's wisdom without bristling at Proclus's tone. And so what we see here is a sort of self-awareness by Proclus, that his ideas were meaningful. His need to intervene in public life was essential, but he needed to do it differently. He needed to find a different messenger because he was simply too abrasive to actually do this effectively. And so Proclus's outsourcing of public advocacy to Archaeades enabled him to correct problematic behavior that endangered Proclus's continuing ability to teach in Athens. But once Proclus adjusted his approach to public life, the Athenian Platonic school thrived. It became the center to which leading philosophical minds of the middle 5th century were drawn. And because of this, Proclus's teaching has exercised a major influence on the Platonic tradition. But it's hard to imagine how that would have happened if his behavior had continued along the lines that it sort of followed in the first years that he was in charge. So Plotinus, Maximus, and Proclus, in a sense, give us 3 rough paradigms for how the personality of a philosopher could affect his or her role in the Platonic tradition. But our view into each of these figures is known primarily from biographers written by admirers after their death. And in a sense, this gets us some of the way to answering this question of the dynamic relationship between teaching and personality. But what we have in these texts are fully formed historical figures whose historical legacies have been, in a sense, amalgamated so that we have something shaped by the totality of their lives' narratives. We aren't getting a dynamic portrait. Instead, what we're getting is a portrait that is fixed in time. It's a historical legacy of a figure. And so it doesn't capture the dynamic interplay of personalities, social conditions, teaching, and basically evolution of the person that I'm really trying to get at. And so we're fortunate that we have a unique set of materials from the late 5th and early 6th century in Alexandria that I think show us some of the interplay between personality and context within the Athenian or within the Platonic philosophical tradition. And these center on the responses to the Aristotelian influenced doctrine of the eternity of the cosmos that was penned after a spurt of persecution directed against pagan teachers in the 480s. This moment gives us a robust collection of Christian anti-eternalist texts that were written by students who studied under Ammonius Hermiae, a brilliant but controversial teacher who dominated Alexandrian teaching for a half century. And we also get to see texts that talk about Ammonius after this moment. And so what we can see with Ammonius is, in a sense, a number of snapshots in time. They aren't as precise and developed as, say, that of Plotinus and Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, but they are, in a sense, chronologically dynamic. And so they allow us to potentially see some difference, some change. And we can also see potentially how this affects Ammonius's legacy. Now, the climate in Ammonius's school seems to have been a lot more like the tense situation surrounding Maximus of Ephesus than the open and friendly discussions of Plotinus's circle, at least initially. But the tensions in Ammonius's school are kind of unique because they involve multiple problematic teachers rather than just one jerk. Also, they apparently break down along religious lines in a way that was not normal in Alexandria in the middle 5th century. Because the story of philosophy in Alexandria in the 5th century is generally one of peaceful and cooperative pagan and Christian interaction. And this is not just a 5th century story. The 400 years, or the nearly 400 years that stretch from Plotinus's time with Ammonius Saccas in the early 200s until the death of Olympiodorus in 565, is a time in which Alexandrian pagans and Christians generally found ways to function together in intellectual circles. But despite these religious differences, the circles much more closely resembled the experience of an intellectual family, like that around Plotinus, than the unwelcoming and kind of scary circle that Maximus headed. And some of these examples of Alexandrian philosophical circles are pretty well known. So Synesius, for example, frequently claimed that he was a devoted philosophical child of his pagan philosophical mother, Hypatia. And we see this echoed, of course, in lots of other philosophical texts, ranging from texts of Plato all the way through, much later texts of the 6th century. Aeneas of Gaza is a more interesting case. The Christian-trained devotee of the Athenian-trained Alexandrian teacher, Heracles, he also spoke about how his circle that he studied in was a philosophical family, a school of his teacher in which the master raised him to philosophize from childhood, and the fellow students were taught to love one another in much the way that sort of philosophical families would. But the collection of colleagues working around Ammonius stands out for their failure in the 470s and 480s to inspire the usual level of loyalty and cohesion among their students. So Ammonius is in some ways a particularly interesting test case for this challenge, because Ammonius is actually philosophical royalty. He's the son of Hermias, who is a fellow student of Proclus in Athens, and Edicea, who is the daughter of Proclus's teacher Syrianus. And Ammonius was brought up as a sort of Platonic prince. His mother took particular care of her son's education and philosophy, and actually arranged to hand down the public professorship that Ammonius's father had held in Alexandria. And then Edicea even not only managed to hand this down, but she managed to kind of reserve the position so that the public financial support given to Hermias would be, in a sense, continued to be bestowed on the family until Ammonius was ready to take up the position. And this is something that Damasius says no other man or woman has ever achieved, at least to Damasius's knowledge. And Ammonius was on one level worthy of this. He was taken to Athens to study under Proclus, and Damasius wrote about him that Ammonius was an exemplary hard worker who made the greatest contribution of all commentators who were ever born. And he distinguished himself from his contemporaries, nearly everyone who ever lived in geometry and astronomy. And so when Ammonius returned to Alexandria around 470, he did it as an endowed chair of philosophy who probably had not even reached his 30th birthday yet. And here we are in Alexandria. Now, while Edicea lived, it seemed that Ammonius's behavior was to some degree moderated. He maintained, it seems, good relationships with members of the philosophical intellectual community. Damasius, for example, knew him and the family so well that he actually gave a funeral oration for Edicea when she died at some point in the mid-470s. But as the 470s gave way to the 480s, it seems that something happened. The story that we can piece together from our pagan and Christian literary sources describe Ammonius kind of going off the rails. And one of the things at the center of this was a rebellion where a poet named Pamphilus was brought to Alexandria to court intellectuals so that they might be persuaded to support this rebellion in 484. Now, both Damasius on the pagan side and Zacharias on the Christian side deeply disapproved of Pamphilus. This is one of the very few things that they could agree on. Damasius calls him dark and repellent and claimed that he was responsible for many misfortunes in the state, whereas Zacharias talks of Christians becoming alarmed because Ilus, the general who was leading this rebellion, was deceived by Pamphilus. And those Christians then consulted with a Gazan holy man who had to reassure them that this revolt would only be a cloud that would quickly dissipate. But this political tension mixed with a philosophical dispute to kind of heighten the challenges facing Christian students and pagan teachers in keeping together a philosophical community like we've seen in Alexandria. And this is something that gets centered on the question of whether the world is eternal and consequently whether the Christian eschaton is philosophically possible. And this dispute became particularly important because a strand of Christian thought arose that indicated that the world was destined to end around the year 500. And this argument reflected Christian concerns that to Christian students were quite immediate. And Christian students were concerned that when the world ended, which seemed like it would happen, any day, what would happen to their souls and bodies? And not surprisingly, this is something that sparks lots of discussion in Alexandrian philosophical environments. No less than 4 Alexandrian and Christian and Gazan Christian authors wrote works about this topic in the period between about the mid to late 480s and the early 520s. And so there's ample fuel for an explosion. And yet, lots of these arguments were happening across the Mediterranean. And Alexandria is the only place in which this explosion occurred. Gaza, for example, was a Christian majority city that was strongly linked to the Alexandrian intellectual orbit, but there's no physical or rhetorical violence there. There's no explosion in Gaza. And in fact, two of the Gazan authors who wrote anti-eternalist works actually treated their adversaries respectfully. And so there's philosophical disagreement, but there's not violence, there's not explosion, there's tension, but there is a very deliberate effort to downplay the personal implications of this, to such a degree that Aeneas of Gaza actually hid the identities of the eternalist thinkers that he's attacking under a pseudonym, a character named Theophrastus, who represents a philosophical point of view, but is not identifiable with any actual individual. But Alexandria is very clearly different because what Aeneas is trying to avoid, Christians in Alexandria are actually trying to facilitate. And this leads eventually to a riot in which a student was attacked after his conversion to Christianity, an imperial investigation in 488 that saw a pagan philosopher die, another flee from the city, and those who remained agree to restrictions on their teachings. And this is a set of circumstances that have been studied thoroughly over the past 2.5 decades, but the tense political and theological disputes that roiled the pagan and Christian communities in the 480s are certainly the primary causes of this violence, but they aren't the only causes of these violence, because this tension existed in other places as well. There's a third ingredient that I think we need to begin to look at quite seriously. And this is, to put it bluntly, the fact that Ammonius seems to have been a jerk on the level of peak Maximus of Ephesus, and his colleagues are not much better. And their troubling behavior apparently began relatively early, probably after the moderating influence of Edicea was gone. And so we have an example from the reign of Zeno, where Ammonius fell into a very public quarrel with a highly esteemed Praetorian prefect named Erythrius. And this is remarkable, not only because it happened not long after Ammonius returned to Alexandria and his mother died, but also because Erythrius seems to be actually a very easy man to get along with. He's actually famously easy to get along with. The battle with Ammonius came when Erythrius, who's a man widely respected for his moderation and renowned for his integrity, was in his third stint as Praetorian prefect. And the historian Malchus writes that this is actually a remarkable term in office, because Erythrius resigned from office when he saw that the public funds were not sufficient, since he could neither stand to put a greater tax burden upon the taxpayers, nor, as a generous person, do anything wrong on account of the public debt. And when he did this, we're told, he brought grief to the city, since he alone of those who then possessed political power had shown himself to be interested in the common good. He offered indulgences rather quickly to those who made requests, and he was completely incapable of taking vengeance on anyone who had offended him in the past. Erythrius even named his daughter Hypatia, which may be a sign of his philosophical inclinations. And so what we have here is a person who you would imagine a philosopher would not only be able to get along with, since everybody seems to be able to get along with him, but also they would probably praise him for his philosophical behaviors, his prudence, his temperance, his moderation, and his ability to behave in a fashion that puts him very much against a corrupt political structure in the 470s. And yet, Damascius tells us, Ammonius and Erythrius fought against one another in Constantinople and always pushed one another into the greatest dangers. And it seems very hard, given what we know about Erythrius, that Erythrius should be blamed for this quarrel. Now, Damascius pens an even more powerful indictment of Ammonius after he saw how the teacher behaved following the investigations of 488. And it's worth quoting this in full. This is a very famous passage. And I think lots of people on this call and in this meeting have talked about this passage before. Ammonius was shamefully greedy and looked at everything in terms of how it might be profitable, reaching an agreement with the one who was then the bishop of the prevailing belief. Now, we can talk more about what this means in a little bit, but what's interesting is Damascius is not the only one who attacks the character of Ammonius. Again, I said that Damascius and Zacharias don't agree on very much. They don't agree on very much, but they do agree that they do not like Ammonius's character. So Zacharias calls Ammonius the interpreter of Plato and Aristotle's doctrine, who's come back from the philosopher Proclus and is now boasting throughout Alexandria that he's wise and promises to make others properly wise if they join his circle and become his hearers. And Zacharias also has one of the interlocutors in his dialogue featuring Ammonius ask, tell me now, how is Ammonius' school in the assembly of his hearers? Tell me too, if good and noble youths who are strong in soul study alongside him, because this clever man corrupts the souls of youth. And Zacharias also attacks his manner of teaching by saying that he is like that of interpreters of oracles, because he sits on his high seat like a sophist and he speaks in pompous manner. And this is one of the high seats in Bibliotheca. Very well could be the high seat that Ammonius was sitting on at that moment. And as the dialogue progresses, Zacharias attacks Ammonius again and talks about how Ammonius, when he's beginning to lose the argument, he orders those people who in the past had been so full of his garrulousness and silliness to go outside and not listen to what was being said so that they would not be persuaded by his argument. Now, this is, of course, a very different tone from that adopted by Aeneas and his Theophrastus, but shutting down discussion like this is also, of course, antithetical to what we see of the virtues that Porphyry, for example, praises in Plotinus. This is a figure who's behaving very much like Maximus, not like Plotinus. So it may be easy to dismiss the accounts of Zacharias and Damascus as biased attacks on a man that neither one liked. And it's true, neither one of them liked Ammonius. But instead of dismissing these portraits of the philosopher, we should take them as evidence that Ammonius, the most prominent teacher of philosophy in Alexandria during this troubled time, was indeed unlikable. Because again, these are two men who don't agree on much of anything, but they don't like Ammonius. They don't like his behavior at that moment. And our evidence certainly supports the conclusion that the Ammonius of the 470s and 480s was irascible, haughty, and quarrelsome. And none of what we have in our materials from this period survives to contradict this evaluation of his character. In fact, our sources are universal that this is who Ammonius was at that moment. And once we take this step, we can see that many of Ammonius's colleagues are also challenging to deal with. So the philosopher Heropolion proved to be a poor mentor who refused to intervene when he knew a homesick student was being bullied. Even Isidore, whom Damascus revered, is incapable of behaving in a mild or passionless manner when pronouncing on human wickedness. He was even quicker to censure vice, and this is why he often came into conflict with many people. So these are clearly not men who possess the social skills to keep a community that is intellectually and religiously diverse together during a politically and intellectually fraught time. Now, this can seem like a minor problem. Lots of philosophers couldn't get along with others. And actually, if you read Eunapius, you see that it's actually rare to find a philosopher who is renowned for being able to get along with people. But the irascibility and social awkwardness of these men helps explain why Alexandria and Alexandria alone saw violence cleave apart its normally well-integrated philosophical circles in the 480s. After all, Gaza, Aphrodisias, and even Athens were buffeted by the same general cultural and political storms that so deeply damaged the Alexandrian schools in the 480s. But none of them saw such profound violence. Although to be fair, none of these cities had quite the same mixture of difficult pagan teachers and Christian students. Now, if we look at the impact that an individual personality could have on things as historically important as the communal history of a major city or the course of late Roman intellectual history, it's clear that this isn't fashionable. And it's clear that our sources are somewhat limited in how they talk about this. But as the cases of Xenocrates, Plotinus, Maximus, and Proclus show, it's certainly historically worthwhile to at least consider, because nice teachers tended to have devoted students who protected their interests, edited their texts, and perpetuated their legacies. Jerks did not. But there's even more we can take away from focusing on the terrible behavior of Ammonius and his colleagues in the 470s and 480s, because the tension one sees in the schools during this time actually is not reflected when the next big batch of texts related to Ammonius' school emerge in the 510s and 520s. So in the works of Plotinus and Olympiodorus, the arrogant and abrasive Ammonius no longer seems to appear. So in his gorgeous commentary, for example, Olympiodorus records a group of anecdotes he heard from Ammonius, in which the old teacher seems much more friendly and easy to get along with, more a kind of interesting grandfather than an irascible princeling. Perhaps the funniest comes at 32:9, when Olympiodorus notes that Ammonius once told him that as a child, he shared the common Egyptian belief that magicians can turn men into crocodile or asses. But Ammonius no longer thinks this because he grew up. And this is a bit of self-effacing humor that it's hard to see in something like the Ammonius portrayed by Zacharias. But even more interesting, the Ammonius commentary shows us, or the Gorgias commentary shows us an Ammonius who's able to get along with elites and governors. So the picture we have in Damascius's Life of Isidore in the 470s is Ammonius who couldn't get along with the most agreeable of government officials imaginable. The Gorgias commentary, though, shows Ammonius reminiscing about his good relationship with Solon, the dux, the military governor of Egypt, and the physician Jacob, a man whose name suggests he was probably either Jewish or Christian. Philoponus too seems to have a positive relationship with Ammonius, even though, like Zacharias, Philoponus strongly disagreed with his teacher about the Aristotelian idea of the eternity of the world. And so this suggests perhaps that a small tweak is necessary to our history of later Alexandrian philosophers. Many people, me included, maybe me primarily, have highlighted Ammonius's deal with the bishop Peter Mongus as a step that de-emphasized the theurgical relationship or the theurgical aspects of Athenian Neoplatonism in exchange for an end to the investigations that targeted philosophers. And I still think that this is a good explanation for why, in the big picture, Alexandrian bishops leave pagan philosophers alone for the next century. But I also suspect that something much more subtle played a role in shifting the dynamics of the school and its city. As we know, Heraclion converted to Christianity and Isidore fled. And then it seems Ammonius's behavior changed and he becomes less of a jerk. Now, there's no way to quantify this or really even document it because our biographies, the main things that talk about the character of these teachers, do not talk about Ammonius in this period of his life. But our commentaries do suggest a person with a different kind of relationship to people in power than he had in the 470s, and a different kind of relationship to people of different religious backgrounds than he had in the 480s. Proclus, Ammonius's teacher, again offers us something of a model because Proclus himself did something similar to salvage his career and his legacy in Athens. Proclus would have agreed that the wise philosopher recognizes his limitations, learns from his mistakes, and adapts. So Ammonius's apparent adaptability not only appears to mirror that of Proclus, but it also contrasts with the behavior of his colleague Isidore. Isidore famously fled Athens for Alexandria, or fled Alexandria for Athens, and then continued his pattern of irritating people. So we already saw how Damascus confesses that Isidore often came into conflict with many people, but his experiences in the 480s, if anything, seem to have made Isidore even more irascible. Damascus claims that he was both miserly and litigious. In a fragment of the life of Isidore that presumably talks either about Isidore's interaction with Christians or his behavior around prominent people in his home cities, Damascus writes admiringly that he utterly rejected those people as being incurably polluted and nothing whatever would compel him to accept their company. And so he neither dined with the rich nor accepted their gifts. This is, of course, a real problem for a teacher who needs to work with wealthy patrons, government officials, and local elites. And it's a problem that quite obviously Ammonius no longer shared in this moment. Damascus excuses this simply as a case where Isidore's criticisms seem to be wholly justified, at least on an unbiased judgment. But for those who judge by common and ordinary criteria, he often appeared to go too far. Yeah, he did. People thought Isidore to be an arrogant jerk, unless they were among the very few philosophical initiates capable of unbiased judgment. But Isidore isn't the only Athenian teacher to rub people the wrong way in the period after the 480s. Proclus' successor Marinus fell into a dispute with Theogenes, a senator and one of the leading donors to the Athenian school. Now, Marinus seems to have been less a jerk than basically just socially awkward. Samaritan convert to paganism, Marinus was never super comfortable in this environment. So Damascius tells us that in social gatherings, he was clumsy. He says that in the strife concerning succession in the Athenian school, Marinus attached himself to the weaker faction. And because of this strife, Marinus departed from Athens to Epidavros because he suspected that plots were being directed against his person. What we see here is a failure of character. But then Hegius, the man who ultimately took over the school following Marinus's death, behaved with an even more dangerous eccentricity. So Hegius aspired to be the most pious of men, and he restored most holy places that had been ruined long ago with an enthusiasm that was more indiscreet than pious. Thus, he became notorious among his compatriots and attracted to himself dangerous enemies. So what is our Athenian story? Well, our Athenian story is this: Isidore's irascibility, Marinus's social awkwardness, and Hegius's eccentricity might seem innocuous, but along with Ammonius's apparent adaptability, these personal characteristics catalyzed the process through which the public school of Ammonius in Alexandria surpassed the wealthy and politically well-connected Athenian school of Proclus' successors. Alexandria's ascent and Athens' decline continued into the 6th century, despite the emergence of the Athenian scholar Damascius, his generation's most dynamic and gifted philosophical mind. So we have no narrative description of Damascius's personality. The closest we get is Agathias's description of his flight to Persia. But Damascius's celebration of Isidore's principled rudeness and combativeness certainly does not suggest that Damascius would have embraced Platinian mildness and patience. And it's perhaps not at all surprising that under his leadership, the Athenian school shut down in 529, and the leading philosophers fled Athens in 532, in part because of local conditions that led to the strict application of laws issued by the Emperor Justinian. These laws were not applied in Alexandria. In Alexandria, the much less impressive but more patient Olympiodorus continued teaching. Indeed, his tolerance for student badgering in his gorgeous commentary is kind of inspiring in a weird way. And like late career Ammonius, Olympiodorus had friendly relationships with government officials that extended actually to his being present among the Alexandrian dignitaries who welcomed the new imperial governor Hephaestus to the city in 546. And when we know what we know about these events, these kind of Adventist ceremonies, it actually is quite important that Olympiodorus was there. Because these Adventist ceremonies involves the governor entering into the city in a ceremonial procession, a sort of panegyric being delivered for that governor, and all of the sort of notables who are in good standing presenting themselves in a very public way to acknowledge their support for that governor. This is a statement, and this is a position that is in some ways similar to what Hypatia used to do. In fact, we're told explicitly, this is what Hypatia used to do. And so this is a different way of behaving, a direct contrast in a sense to what the Athenian philosophers are doing, refusing to meet with government officials, refusing to interact with them, refusing to play a role in the society and the state around them. Now, while not an exact parallel to Xenocrates' victory over Aristotle in the 330s BC, Olympiodorus' success over more prominent and more gifted philosophers in Athens had, I think, even more profound implications for the future of philosophy, because it was Alexandria, not Athens, that shaped the curriculum and textual traditions handed down to later centuries of Constantinopolitan, Baghdadi, and Florentine philosophers. And so one can wonder how different things might have looked if later Athenian teachers had shared Plotinus's personality along with his philosophical skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed, for the Neoplatonic panorama, really. I can imagine there are a lot of questions. So I propose that we use the chat to say that we have a question, and perhaps a queue for question would suffice. And then I will try to make sure that the order in which the questions appear in the chat will be kept. So there is already a question by Crystal. Yes. Crystal, hi.
Hi, Irene, and hi, Edward and everyone else. Edward, thank you so much for a wonderful and very thought-provoking presentation today. I had a question when you were talking about Ammonius and you were talking about his character and actions contributing towards violence in Alexandria. I was thinking, well, but the violence obviously started much earlier, you know, with Hypatia's death and the destruction of the Temple of Serapis. And also, you know, in relation to Ammonius's character, I mean, Damascus, you know, as you've noted in your own works before, is famously grumpy and can sound very grumpy about different philosophers. Zacharias clearly has something of an agenda in terms of pagan-Christian relations. So I just wondered if you could talk about the wider pagan-Christian conflict and the possible trauma that the Alexandrian school and maybe the Athenian school as well were experiencing in the aftermath of those events around Hypatia. And then I also just wanted to ask you briefly, I hope you don't mind, about the influence of the women in the Alexandrian and Athenian schools. You talked about Idicia a little bit there, and I just wondered if you had any further thoughts on the women in those schools. Thank you.
Sure. So this is a great question. So I think that one of the things that's important about the aftermath of the murder of Hypatia is Hypatia is killed in 415. And so the people we're talking about are not alive then, right? So it's not a living memory of Hypatia. It's instead a memory of the event that's filtered through historical traditions that are, historical traditions that are, in a sense, refracted through the contemporary experiences of those philosophers. So Alexandria in the 450s, in the 460s, and the 470s was not a place where there was pagan Christian violence. It was a place where there was Christian violence. And in these cities, there is always a sort of background level of violence that is really significant. It's a society that has a level of violence that, you know, in a modern context, we can't really appreciate. The background level of violence in later Roman society is immense. But the way that violence would have affected philosophers in Alexandria in the period between Hypatia's murder and what happens with Ilus, I think is pretty minimal. So you do have accounts of philosophers being tortured in Constantinople in, it seems probably the 440s or 450s. You have accounts of, you know, accounts like what happened with Hypatia and with the Serapeum. But these are, in a sense, not Alexandrian stories. And part of why the philosophers in the 480s are more willing to listen to Pamphilus is because they don't have memory of that violence. You know, they've existed in an environment where that violence is not really happening to them anymore. And they just misjudge how much space they have to do the kinds of things that they do. I think that the question, and this is a very challenging thing to try to work with as a historian, is what do we do with Damascus and Zacharias? Because they both don't like Ammonius. But we don't have anybody who does like Ammonius in that period, right? The sources we have for Ammonius in that period are not positive sources. The sources we have for Ammonius later are pretty positive sources. So we can step back and say, well, Damascus and Zacharias didn't like Ammonius, and that's certainly true. And when they say that he's behaving badly towards other people, I think that's also certainly true. But we actually don't have anybody who's saying he's behaving nicely towards people. And so we have a figure where our only evidence for his behavior in the 470s and 480s are he's pretty difficult to get along with. And then our sources later give us a different view of him. I think we can do two things with that. We can say, well, this is just a feature of our sources. But we actually have quite a few sources for Ammonius compared to, say, other philosophers in late antiquity. And so I think we can either say, well, okay, that's a feature of our sources and our sources are just different, the 510s or 520s, or we can say, well, no, actually, let's trust our sources and see that maybe that difference reflects some reality in how Ammonius was behaving. We can't answer that question, but I am kind of inclined to say when your sources are uniformly saying on one hand, somebody's doing a bad job of interacting with his fellow humans at one moment, and then he seems to be doing a pretty good job of interacting with fellow humans that he had trouble with earlier, that's at least something that's worth exploring. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to do here. I think Proclus gives us a way to explore that, where we can see somebody making that kind of change for that very same reason. And so I think we should be at least willing to entertain the fact that something actually happened there. As for the women, there's a really, really interesting phenomenon that I think we can trace all the way back into the late Roman Republic. And this is, when I put on my political historian hat, this is something that I'm seeing. There's a way for women to behave politically and behave publicly that gives them much more freedom to speak plainly and to participate in activities that men might be concerned to do. So the sort of advocacy that Edicea does for her son and this preserving of the public professorship, I think is something that only a woman could do effectively. I mean, a man could try, but going all the way back to Hortensia in the late Roman Republic, what we see are women are very aware of the fact that they cannot benefit personally from this kind of advocacy. And so when they do it, it's actually more effective because it looks like they're doing it out of pure principle, not out of kind of self-interest, but instead out of just, this is something that ought to be done. That extends also to the sort of teaching that they're doing. Some of the more risky teaching, the theurgical teaching and the stuff that could bring us philosophical circle into sort of trouble with imperial officials, this is something that women are doing. And interestingly, I think we see the men understand that to some degree, but the men are also not fully understanding of what the experience of these women is going to be like. And so these sources are in a way kind of, cringy. It's kind of cringy to read Damasius writing about women. In fact, the life of Isidore is dedicated to women, and yet he's still making jokes like talking about Hypatia wearing a tribune, wearing a tribon, using a feminine participle because he thinks it's a cute little joke. I don't think the people to whom the life of Isidore was addressed would have thought that was a cute little joke. So I think that there's a level of appreciation for the role that women uniquely play in these communities. But I also think there's a disconnect that doesn't kind of get these men all the way to where we would like them to be. They're not enlightened completely. They don't understand that some of what they're saying is idiotic or offensive. But they do really, really value the place for women in their communities. So sorry if I went on too long, but these are really great questions.
Thank you so much, Ed, especially for your thoughts on women in these communities. Really useful. Thank you.
So I can see there are some raised hands as well. Professor Altman.
Yes, Edward, I'd like to go back to where you began with the life of Plotinus by Porphyry and push back a little bit on your very complimentary portrait of Plotinus. I mean, the life, it seems to me, is about two teachers, isn't it? I mean, Porphyry has two teachers. He's had Longinus as a teacher, and then he has Plotinus as a teacher. And I suggest to you that the Athenian one is the one that's not the jerk. So let me just briefly make that case. Porphyry shows up in Rome, maintaining what I regard as the very plausible position that noeta are outside of the mind. Plotinus hears that, deputizes his henchman Emilius to refute the newcomer. The newcomer then responds to Aemilius. Aemilius then refutes him again. And then, suffering those two, Porphyry delivers a palinode, which then Plotinus compels him to read aloud in public. Compare that with the way that his former teacher Longinus treated this same Porphyry. He clearly is hurt by the fact that Porphyry has abandoned what he taught him about the location of the intelligibles. But he never gives up on the young man, even when he has made it clear that he prefers the tutelage of Plotinus to himself. And not only writes concerning the end, Peritelos, not only writes a treatise to push back on his student's palinode, but is now writing another treatise against Plotinus and Aemilius that, in fact, Porphyry quotes at length. So I'm wondering how you would respond to this. That although I admit that it appears that Plotinus is a great guy, and you read the beautiful portrait of his shining face and so forth. But remember that Porphyry actually begins his first portrait of Plotinus with a picture of him in his illness, a hideous monstrosity of decay and horror, who still insists on kissing anybody that comes to see him. So I suggest to you, and here I'm trying to stand up for Athens against Alexandria, that it's really the Athenian that is not the jerk, that Cassius Longinus, who gives up his life supporting Zenobia in fighting against one Roman emperor, is less of a jerk than the guy that beseeches a beautiful resort in the vicinity of Pompeii from another Roman emperor to create a phony baloney Platinopolis. Okay.
So I think that those are really good points. And I think that the Longinus versus Plotinus situation is complicated for a bunch of reasons, but I think the situation with Zenobia in particular is complicated because what Aurelian effectively does there is blame Longinus for causing this. What Aurelian really wants to do following his suppression of the Gallic Empire and Zenobia's revolt is he wants to bring about reconciliation. And so Zenobia is allowed to marry a senator. What's his name? Babylathus is allowed to become a senator. Tetricus from the West is allowed to govern a province. His son is allowed to become a senator. And he has to blame somebody for this, so he blames Longinus. And Longinus is killed basically as the figure who foments revolt by, serving as the inspiration to Zenobia in this context. And he's a fall guy. And so I think with Longinus, when we get outside of the philosophical context, we get into the historical sources, it's clear what's happened there. He is getting a raw deal. Aurelian wants he needs to blame somebody, so he blames Longinus. So I think that it's certainly possible to speak up for Longinus and say that Longinus wasn't a jerk either. I think that, with all of these figures, the challenge is always that, they are arguing ideas with other people. And with Maximus, he doesn't seem to inspire devotion from hardly anybody. He doesn't actually create much, people don't even like being in his circle, really. It's inspirational, but it's not comfortable. And that, I think, is the fundamental breakdown that is really striking in Alexandria in the 470s is the breakdown of this intellectual family. So I think Longinus certainly was able to build that. And that's why the betrayal in his view of Porphyry is so profound, because there is a family there. And what Porphyry does is he, in a sense, he doesn't jump schools so much as he, jumps families. And that idea is so deeply integrated into the Platonic tradition. It's all the way back into some of the pseudo-Platonic dialogues that talk about trading your biological family for your intellectual family. And so I think what we see with Plotinus is, there's disagreements with lots of other thinkers, but the circle is actually a very strong one. And I think Longinus' circle also was a strong one. I honestly don't think either one of those men were jerks. The picture we have of Longinus is, I think, deeply, deeply tainted by what's done to him by Aurelian. And I think that still allows us to look at the breakdown of the environments that these effective circles are able to maintain in places where the circle falls apart. And what's interesting about Ammonius is that circle looks like it falls apart and then gets reconstructed. That's intriguing. Something happened there. And so I think what happened there is, we can piece it together as best we can. But I think you're right that in the context of Plotinus and Longinus, when we're looking at the ability of a teacher to kind of inspire not only strong relationships with an inner circle, but strong relationships with the acroates, the acroate, the people who are casual-ish associates of the teacher, that also I think is a much more profound indication of the success of the teacher than just what happens with the inner circle. And I think both Longinus and Plotinus would qualify as good guys.
Thank you. So I'm trying to keep the order, but I'm not sure I'm always successful. So I think it is Professor Bernau, please.
Hi, Ed. Hi, everybody.
Hi,
I really enjoyed this talk. It's a very interesting approach. The sort of the two-pronged intellectual history and then the psychological history of the intellectual history. But I'm not very strong in the in Neoplatonism. I'm very much interested in the Stoics, and in their, you do find Stoic material in the Neoplatonists, but that's not really a succession at all. Chrysippus is my favorite, but he never actually, I think he wrote over, he's credited by Diogenes Laertius, who is a predecessor of your approach to the question of intellect and psychology, I think. He wrote over 500 works, but none of them actually remain. It's all from people who are basically attacking him and who then give us big chunks of it. Galen, for example. So anyway, I was just curious. And one other completely irrelevant thing, perhaps, I'm reading a couple of books, Time of the Magicians and Continental Divide, which are very interesting studies, one of the focuses of which is the relation between Heidegger and Cassirer. And that's a wonderful interplay of the conflict of ideas and the conflict of the radical repellence of personalities. So anyway, Carneades and Chrysippus are kind of like twins, it seems to me. And the skeptics have a position which involves not having a position, but depending in an antagonistic way on other people having positions. And that means that there's a kind of, what shall I say, a love-hate relationship built into their approach. And I think some of that comes down, not perhaps biographical, but doxographical between Carneades and Chrysippus. Now, this is all very disjointed. I hope you can make some sense of it. But anyway, I did enjoy it very much. I found it very stimulating. And it's, of course, an interaction because personality is not fixed, as you showed. And so becoming a philosopher, perhaps, is a good way to change your personality.
Yeah, I think, so we do see really good examples in context, in ancient context, but also in Byzantine context of personalities shifting. I mean, what Xenocrates does to Palermo, that's the perfect example. I mean, that's in a sense, the prototypical example of a philosophical conversion. I think, much later, what happens with Platon is actually quite interesting too, the way that Platon kind of moves intellectually across his career. I think that one of the challenges that all of us working on ancient philosophy face is the channels through which these ideas pass as living traditions at certain moments in time become quite narrow. And so, the Alexandria to Baghdad narrative is actually a really important narrative because what it reflects is a moment where that intellectual tradition becomes extremely narrow. where you can see the sort of personal aspects of the transmission dominating the way that the ideas are transmitted and the way that the lineages and identifications with philosophical ancestors are also transmitted. And this is why I think the failure of the Athenian school in the 6th century is so important, because what you have is an Alexandrian lineage. An Alexandrian lineage that in the 7th century moves to Constantinople, but also, through Syriac translation, through people like Sergius of Rashana, moves as a living tradition through Semitic languages. And, both of those to a degree influence what happens in Baghdad and in subsequent centuries. And so that is, in a sense, perhaps why we can explain what happens with, the Stoic tradition. What you have there is a textual tradition that is not sustained by a living personal tradition after a certain point. And so those texts disappear because there's no one invested in a kind of golden chain to perpetuate not just the reading of the text, but the meaning of those texts in a social circle. And so the personalities matter greatly because what they do is they provide the kind of living context that makes you invested in this tradition. And I think in a way, the most pessimistic work of all of late antique philosophy is Boethius's translation project, because Boethius is anticipating that there is not going to be a living tradition anymore. That person who can communicate this to you isn't there. And that's why you get Aristotle and Aristotelian commentaries in a kind of disembodied form as just a textual tradition, because Boethius doesn't believe there's going to be a personal aspect to that. And the Alexandrians never get there. That's not how they're working. They're assuming that there's going to be a kind of personal connection. But I think if you look at, say, what Simplicius is writing after the return from Persia, Simplicius is anticipating this becoming a purely textual tradition. That's different from Olympiodorus. It's different from the sorts of things that Olympiodorus seems to be interested in doing. So I think that, perhaps the Stoics and the Epicureans, to a degree, give us a way to understand why the personalities matter so greatly. If you're Maximus of Ephesus and you're a tremendous inspirational thinker, but you can't get along with anybody, your tradition is not likely to survive for very long, because the people that you inspire are not, they might not stick with you. But also, if they actually follow your example of behaving in that way towards other people, it's not going to be a living tradition as soon as someone slightly less inspirational is there, because you'll go to a teacher who maybe isn't as skilled, but is a better person. You'll go to Xenocrates instead of Heraclides of Pontus, or you'll go to Olympiodorus instead of Damascius. So I think that's an aspect that I think the history of philosophy does show to be quite profound over time, right? You need to have a living tradition with actual people learning from other people for the tradition to remain dynamic. And if not, you have to have a really significant and skilled sort of intellectual revivifier who can come through and take something out of text and create a personal environment that sustains it. But it's a real challenge. And I think that's one of the things, our sources don't talk about this very much because it's assumed.
Well, yeah, and there's a kind of narrowing in the tradition of the Stoics themselves. When you get to Roman Stoicism and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, they don't really ask the same kind of questions that Chrysippus did. It's actually, there's a current revival in America of Stoicism as a way of life, how to think like a Stoic or react like a Stoic. But that's all, what shall I say, a very narrow continuity. And it's amazing that people did not save any of the works of Chrysippus, I think, because he seems to be a very a thinker who covered all the bases, and that just did not carry on in people like Marcus Aurelius. Not that that's bad, but it is a loss.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Marcus has become the patron saint of Silicon Valley, but in a sense, it's unmediated Marcus. If you look at like what's actually the books that are actually selling, it's Marcus directly. It's not people writing about Marcus. The different versions of the meditations are always among the best sellers.
New editions now,
Yeah, but the people from Silicon Valley are interacting with this textually. They're not interacting with it in any mediated form at all.
We got a handbook now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think it is Professor Dillon's turn now.
I think
Your
you're muted.
microphone, you have to turn your microphone on, please.
That's right. Sorry. Now, very good to hear you, Ed.
Good to see you.
Yes, and most entertaining and most thought-provoking. I just wanted to react to two thoughts. One about sort of in relation to Porphyry, and the other to Damascus. I wouldn't wish to suggest whether either that Plotinus was a jerk or that Porphyry was a jerk, but it's interesting that Porphyry doesn't really found much of a school after all this. As we recall, he went off to Lilybaeum having had a sort of mental breakdown or depression, and he doesn't say much about that. But we don't quite know how he sort of took over from Plotinus, or whether there was anything left to take over. I mean, what interests me about Plotinus is that he doesn't have any pupils either, except Porphyry and Emilius, that we know of. I think he had this great circle of enthusiasts, senators and ladies and so on, and obviously lots of people in the seminar. When it comes down to it, we just don't. We know the Senator Rogatianus and so on. We don't know who they were. Now, Porphyry, it seems to me, is a reasonably nice guy, but he disposed of Emilius pretty effectively. Emilius was the senior pupil, and he just, he was crowded out, and he went off to Syria. On the other hand, we know very little about a school or students of Porphyry. There's he dedicates the categories commentary to Gedalius. We don't know who Gedalius was. Anatolius. Now, there's a curious, this Anatolius is said to have been his second in command in a way, as being the teacher of Iamblichus. So the relation between Porphyry and Iamblichus is somewhat obscure, I think, and obviously they didn't get on ultimately. So we know very productive results of that. So he didn't have an awful. I mean, he was nice to his wife Marcella. He's one of the few Platonic philosophers who, apart from Plutarch, who is married. It's rather interesting, but he's not a very successful figure as a teacher, it seems to me. So that's one sort of thought I had. But also, when we go to the Athenian school, when it comes down to it, from Syrianus to Proclus and Hermias, to say, from Proclus to, well, we have the names of a few people after him, but we don't have very many pupils that are of any substance. And what we have, after a few gaps, is Damascus, who, I mean, Damascus amuses me greatly because he is really a very waspish biographer. I mean, almost nobody comes out well entirely out of the life of Isidore. And he himself then has this school, but does he have any followers at all, really? Some people think that Dionysius the Areopagite might have been one, but I doubt it. So in a way, we have a succession of these people, but they don't. I mean, obviously, the whole operation was extremely small. I imagine. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it. How many people at a given time were serious students of any of these people. Less than half a dozen, I would have thought. But not much turns up. The school sort of carries on, just about. But you don't get the feeling that a great many people studied under any of them. And yet, there is a succession. So on. These anyway were the thoughts that occurred to me as you were talking.
I really appreciate that, John. Thank you so much. So, so there's a couple of contextual things that I think are important in understanding maybe the Alexandrian side of this. So there's a series of really significant educational reforms in the 4th century that basically make public what had been a really pretty disorganized educational system. And the Alexandria, the Bibliotheca school, that university complex behind me, that's a perfect example of that, because that's on public land. We know what that land was. We know it was private land that was destroyed in the 270. All the houses were destroyed. It was vacant land. It belonged to the imperial government. There's a bathhouse that they built under the reign of Constantius. And then in the 5th century, they built this giant complex, which we also have documented. We have its organization documented in the University of Constantinople at roughly this same time. And so there is a way that certain teaching positions, as you get out of the 4th century and into the 5th century, you create these kinds of structures that allow students to bleed from the much more popular courses in rhetoric and grammar into courses of philosophy. Now, we know the teaching background, or the allocation of resources, did not favor philosophy in this. In the School of Constantinople, we have basically, I forget it's something like 10 to 1, the number of teachers that teach rhetoric to philosophy. But there is a teacher of philosophy. And what we see in Alexandria is that a lot of these students, they don't become initiates. Some of them do. But a lot of them, they just sit in on courses in philosophy because it's like literally the thing in the classroom right after their rhetoric course. It's literally right next door. And so I think that the 4th century context is really important, because the world that Plotinus is in and the world that Hypatia is in are administratively very, very different from one another. And yet we're only 100 years apart, more or less. So with Plotinus and with Porphyry, you really do have these circles that are functioning in the world of Middle Platonism that you have constructed so well. This decentralized world where there isn't a sort of place that you go over and over and over again to study Platonism. If you're Cicero, you know where you go. If you're Origen, you don't know where you go because there's lots of choices. And I think one of the challenges you get in that moment is it's very hard for a circle to survive for multiple generations. But as you get out of the 4th century and you have these circles that are publicly supported in major cities, they do have the ability to survive for multiple generations, because there's always going to be somebody there. And there's always going to be students who trickle in. And the teacher might inspire them, the teacher might repel them, but the teacher is, in a sense, a tenured person who gets to teach over and over and over again, and can create a circle if he's good enough to do it. The Athenian school is, I think, in a way, a very interesting, I think Athens, the school that Plutarch founds, would not have succeeded in being multi-generational across more than 120 years if it had been built 100 years before. I mean, if this is actually like a late 3rd century school, I don't think it lasts 120 years. But I think a private school that's created in this context is, like Synesius said, a place that can trade on the identity of the intellectual center in which it finds itself, and work as a private institution multi-generationally, because students are continuing to come to that place. And that's what I think is Synesius's great anger at the Athenian school. He thinks it's actually quite inferior to what you have in Alexandria, but it's actually kind of drafting on the reputation of Athens to survive for multiple generations. So what does that do for Porphyry? Frankly, I will have to throw up my hands. I'm not totally sure, but I think that the barrier to keeping a multi-generational enterprise going in the 3rd century is quite high. It's very hard to do. Versus in the late 4th and early 5th century, you have all sorts of structural imperatives that make it a lot easier, unless you're in somewhere random. You know, I think a school in Aphrodisias would have trouble because it isn't going to have the sort of imperial support. It's not going to have the infrastructure, and it's not going to have the regular supply of students that these imperial university towns do have. But I think ultimately, you know, as a corollary to answer a question you didn't answer a question you didn't ask, when we get into the 7th century, that imperial structure breaks, and then we lose those multi-generational institutions again, right? We have them in Syriac monasteries because you do have an institutional structure there, where you can see, for example, students being indoctrinated multiple generations across, you know, being introduced across multiple generations to text and ideas about what the circle is. But the educational structure that grew out of these reforms of the 4th and early 5th century, it dies with Heraclius. It's just not there anymore. And so I think maybe that, in a sense, emphasizes the uniqueness of this 5th and 6th century environment even more.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
Okay, so Professor Natali.
Yes, many thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
No problem.
Well, many thanks for your reconstruction of the debate in Alexandria and Athens in late antiquity. I learned a lot from your speech, and I'm very interested in it. It seems to me that you put a lot of weight on the personal character of philosophers to explain what happens in this time. And how can I say? I was accustomed to consider the character criticism in antiquity as a polemic weapon against adversaries and not take them at face value. For instance, the episode we began with the attack by Aristotle against Plato seems to me to be a fabrication. So I confess I don't believe it. And also at that time, how can we be really sure that the judgment were true and not biased? Even in the case of Ammonius, we are attacked by two sides. Since, as you said, Ammonius tries to take a median way between extreme paganism and extreme Christianism, one can see why he managed to be unpleasant to both sides. It's just a speculation. So my problem is how biased are the sources we rely on? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that there's a dynamic in these sources. I think that the Old Academy sources in particular are really good for this, because they lay bare this dynamic. The dynamic is both about defining the person you don't like negatively and defining the person you do like positively, right? So the story of Aristotle and Xenocrates is one that reflects badly on Aristotle and positively on Xenocrates. And so what that dynamic implies is actually the personality matters, right? It's not just Aristotle's bad. It's Aristotle is bad in a way that is directly the opposite of how Xenocrates is, right? Aristotle is, in that alien passage, mistreating his philosophical father. Xenocrates is the pious, devoted, philosophical son defending his philosophical father. when you look at the way that the old academy is presenting Xenocrates, there's a very clear branding of who Xenocrates is. That he's, he's loyal, he's just, he's temperate. He might not be the most skilled guy, but he's the guy who lives according to what he sees to be philosophical principles. And so when you see those biased sources, it actually is quite interesting because there's another side to that bias as well, right? It's not just the negative attack on someone, but it's a positive building up of the counter. This is actually what I think makes the life of Isidore so interesting. Because when Damascius is working with these other figures, and he's trying to emphasize Isidore is the ideal figure in the life of Isidore, even though Isidore is a deeply, deeply he's a troubling figure to make an ideal. And so I think that what we miss sometimes in that text is what Damascius is in essence doing is he's saying, look, Isidore is horribly unpleasant in a lot of ways, right? Like he's really weird, he's really obnoxious, he irritates people endlessly, and yet he's doing it for principled reasons. And these other people, he's doing it because he believes this to be an embodiment of philosophical principle, and the niceties don't matter if you're upholding philosophical principle. Whereas all of these other people, they just don't measure up to Isidore. And so the text has this really negative, sort of almost aggressive bend, because frankly, the person that it is centered on is not a very positive person. He didn't write anything. He didn't really read anything. He, works sort of through inspiration instead of sort of deep analysis. And his inspiration leads him to be confrontational with a lot of people. He flees his home city. He can't establish himself in Athens. This is a figure who in like every way looks like a failure. So how do you present this as an ideal? You basically say he's doing this because it is a truly inspired way of living according to philosophical principles. And look at the failings of all of these other people. And so I think that what we have to see is that there's a dynamic. I mean, these sources, I think, are not entirely based on fabricated stories about other people. What they're doing is emphasizing aspects of the character on both sides. So was Xenocrates as kind of boring and devoted to temperance and like uninteresting as the sources make out? Probably not. There are probably moments where like Xenocrates, had too much wine or said something stupid or did something that our sources are not going to talk about. And was Aristotle or Heraclides as terrible as the academic sources suggest? Certainly not. But what you're getting, I think, are exaggerations of things that are actually there. But they're exaggerated in a certain way to emphasize the contrast between what's good in whatever our author sort of values and what's bad in the person you're trying to contrast that figure with. And incidentally, that's what makes Eunapius's Maximus so interesting. I mean, he really does want to like Maximus, but it is really, really hard to justify what Maximus did. I mean, it's really hard to justify how Maximus behaves. Even if you like Maximus and think there's a lot about him that is admirable, Eunapius still really struggles with that.
Yes, many thanks. That's very interesting. Just a last small point. I think it's important that the sources are close to the person described, because the sources about the fight internal to the academy are very late. So there'd be other agendas going on those sources. The sources about Alexandria are near contemporary, if I well understood. So that's a much better situation. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a very fair point that you always do. If you are talking about people who know these people and you're trying to talk about personalities, that's actually a lot more meaningful than something that's third hand.
Okay, Professor Shepard.
Okay, I think this is really a comment rather than a question. I mean, that was a fantastic lecture. Thank you very much. I was struck that you seemed to be suggesting that some kind of criterion for of whether a philosopher was, a jerk who didn't have much influence or a much nicer character who did have influence was the extent to which their work survived. And I mean, that works for Plotinus and for Proclus on the one hand, and Maximus on the other. He's supposed to have written commentaries on logic, isn't he? But we haven't got them. And, we haven't got where Maximus's works. We haven't got them. If you try and score Ammonius on that criterion, he comes out fairly well, doesn't he? I mean, there's a little bit in the way of commentaries in his own pen, and then there's things that are apophonies by his students. But I think you can probably just argue that confirms your view. Is that right? That that something happened to him and he became a bit more genial as he got older?
Yeah,
right?
I definitely appreciate the comment that I was establishing criteria. I wasn't trying to, and I think I may have fell into that because I think it's a bit reductionist to have fallen into that. But I do think that the criteria maybe that I would suggest is the living circle. Creating something where people don't just disappear and you're not kind of left alone without any kind of legacy whatsoever. And it's a real challenge because, obviously Iamblichus isn't responsible for the survival of the Iamblican tradition. It's another group of people that are responsible for this. It's not doing terribly well in, the 370s, 380s. It's the revitalization of this in Athens that actually means that tradition becomes as influential as it does. So I'll have to think more about that and what precisely I'll pin down. But I do think that what you see with Ammonius, especially in the way that his students are interacting with his work in the 6th century, is somebody whose students really liked him. And that's really hard to believe based on what we're hearing in the 470s and 480s, unless he's behaving differently towards his students. Because it's not just pagan students who really liked him in the 510s and 520s, it's Christian students too. And so something's different. And it's not that the question about the eternity of the world has gotten less profound. It's actually more serious. There's much more anxiety about this in the 510s, as Philoponus's work in the 520s shows. It's a really serious concern, even into the 520s, and it really fades out with the reign of Justinian. So there is something that has changed. And I think that it is probably most easily explained by the fact that when we see his interactions described in the 6th century works, they don't seem to be this obnoxious person that we see in the 470s and 480s. And actually, on a human level, we can understand that, right? If you can't get along with anybody and you think that you've been raised that you are the best thing that's ever happened to Alexandrian philosophy, and you behave that way for 10 years, and then all of a sudden you get called before an inquisition and you're told to cool it, you probably cool it. So I think we can understand why that would happen. And our sources kind of reflect that. But I'll have to think a lot more about, do I actually want to even set a criteria for how we measure this success? I don't know. But immediately when you described that criteria to me, I didn't love it. So
okay, I suppose what I was thinking was that, I mean, you talk quite a lot about the reports and the historical sources, but from time to time you said things which sort of led me to think that perhaps you were suggesting how far people's work survived was also some sort of indication. Let's back off from the word criterion. And I suppose I was just thinking that gives you another perspective on it. But on the other, then you're ending up with what you call a textual tradition rather than a personal tradition. So I can see why you don't want to go in that direction, perhaps.
Yeah, I would feel more comfortable with it until John's question. And with that, I need to do a little bit more of a think about how does that work with the context of a 3rd to early 4th century school where the institutional support is not there and you can have it disappear very quickly. You just need a successor who's just not quite as charismatic and not quite as good with people. And the institutional structure that would support it in the 5th century is not there in like 400 or 300. And so I think that there is an aspect where the sorting out that would happen in the 5th century is going to be very different from the sorting out in the 3rd or early 4th century. And I just need to think more about that, because John's question about Porphyry, I think, is a really good one. And, so that's why I would back off a little bit on that.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Professor Taran, Harold.
Oh, hello. Hello at last, Ed. Thank you
Hello.
very much. My question basically is, what does one have to do to become known as ho megas philosophos? And I'll explain that question because with Olympiodorus, in the Gorgias commentary, which for all we know might have been written 10 years after Ammonius's death, Ammonius is just ho philosophos, which is accords him a certain honor, but doesn't really go over the top. And Olympiodorus doesn't seem to have very many other people to refer to at that time. When we get to the commentary on the Meteorologica, which might be written 50 years after Ammonius's death, there Ammonius has become ho megas philosophos. And so there's a question of whether it's actually a good tactic to represent your predecessor in such honorific terms, but whatever happens down the line, a couple of Olympiadoran manuscripts refer to him as ho megas philosophos, and so does David, I seem to remember, so that he himself gets that exalted title, even though that we generally can't see precisely why he is such a great philosopher after all. But in between the Gorgias commentary and the Meteorologica commentary, I don't think Olympiodorus refers to Ammonius very much. So I'm sort of questioning the strength of Olympiodorus's evidence when it comes to looking back upon a much nicer Ammonius. But at the same time, Olympiodorus must have managed to become pretty nice himself, I think, in due course.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that comment, and I have not actually looked at the development of ho megas philosophos in that context. I think that the Gorgias commentary reflects an immature Olympiodorus who's really struggling. I mean, we do this too, right? When we don't have a whole lot of material to put in on our own when we're teaching something, it's very easy to fall back on what your teacher taught you. And it's also very authoritative. If you are a young-ish scholar who is also, I think, struggling to establish himself in a city where there's actually someone more important than him who is something of a difficult personality. I mean, Philoponus is a very difficult personality. When you're trying to establish yourself in that context, being a kind of nice guy is a good move. But I think one way to think about how Ammonius becomes ho megas philosophos is perhaps Olympiodorus has done a good job of salesmanship over the intervening years. Whereas Ammonius was once perhaps seen as a sort of living figure that people knew and respected, but understood that there were alternatives out there. By the meteorology is what, like 564, is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
I think the comet was 65, wasn't it? So
okay, yeah. So the text is in the 560s for sure. If we look at what happens if we say that the Gorgias is say 525 to 530, at that moment you have Philoponus pushing really aggressively against these ideas in Alexandria. You have important people in Gaza who don't measure up to these guys, but they're still there. You have the Athenian school still functioning. Olympiodorus is a junior partner in a philosophical environment with lots more accomplished people. By the 560s, he's not. The Athenians are gone. Plotinus is writing tritheist heretical works that are getting condemned by the emperor. Gaza has kind of receded. It's not doing the kinds of stuff it was doing before. He's it. And so in a sense, he's writing from a different position at that moment, where the tradition has kind of moved into that rivulet that is an Alexandrian rivulet. And all of the diversity that you had when he started isn't really there anymore. And so I think that you could have a combination of him basically him selling up Ammonius for 30 years, but he also now has the authority to make that kind of a claim, because there isn't a Simplicius or a Damasius or a Philoponus who could push back in a different way. I haven't followed this enough to know if there's a trigger moment where you see someone gets that because context establishes that now they are the link for that generation in the philosophical tradition, and so they get the title. But my guess is by the 560s, you just have a very different environment than you had in the 520s. And Olympiodorus has done a great deal to create that different environment too. And so I think that's probably a big part of it. And that might be why David is so quick to sort of give this to Olympiodorus. There isn't an alternative at that moment. That is the tradition.
Okay, thanks very much. Great answer.
Zdenek?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting and to a certain extent original. And I would like to, if I understood well, you focus on personality of these different Neoplatonic philosophers and different of characters in order to show that they shaped or influenced social and their social and political activities and success. And I would like to ask if it is not necessary to ask from the bottom-up point of view, so to say, if it is not their access to intelligible reality that is actually grounding their psychological individuality. I say this because it seems to me that there is the conception of personality of these thinkers is really totally different, of course, from our contemporary idea of individual character. And this goes back at least to Plato's Phaedrus, where the hierarchy of incarnation of souls depends on the quality of their vision of the intelligible. And this seems to me that it's particularly true for Plotinus, because Plotinus was famously reluctant to sit in front of a painter because the portrait, would be an image of an image. And even to reveal his birth date and genealogy and or personal information and emotions and so on. And so from a Neoplatonic point of view, couldn't we say that Plotinus' utmost kindness and friendship that Porphyry praises so much springs directly from his incessant intellectual striving to the intelligible, which he precisely describes as pure friendship, contrary to the sensible and political word that is ineluctably between love and hatred. And so to me, Porphyry's devotion towards Plotinus over Longinus makes no doubt, since the last witness he invokes is Apollo, the god himself, to say that Plotinus' soul joined Plato's and Pythagoras in the chorus of immortal Eros, where he might definitely really united himself with the one. And so my question is, I wonder if the different personalities between these Neoplatonic philosophers, as you described, let's say Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, and Damasius, do not go ultimately back from their own theory of personality and individual character to the quality of their intellectual contemplation of intelligible reality, meaning by that, most of all, beauty, truth, and the good. And actually, wouldn't this be the true criteria to the survival of their respective thoughts, and most of all, the incredible edition of Porphyry of the whole Aeneas? Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So I think that the first thing that I would say is that one of the great tensions that these biographies in particular explore is this tension between the ideas that someone advances and the reality that they have in sort of living according to them. One of the great failings of Maximus that, I mean, Eunapius is probably not even capable of understanding the full theoretical implications of what Maximus was teaching. But what Eunapius really explores with Maximus is a failure on Maximus's part to live up to the standards that he himself is supposed to be advancing as a philosopher. And that's something that you also see in, going back to Xenocrates, that's what those traditions are emphasizing. Those academic traditions are emphasizing that, Xenocrates was not as good a thinker, but he at least lived according to what he was teaching. And so I think that we can't just assume that these people taught something and lived according to it. What a lot of these sources are exploring, and what Damascius, for example, is exploring with Ammonius, is that Ammonius understood the philosophy very well, but he didn't live it. And that's one of the tensions that the life of Isidore in particular is exploring, is, for all of the failings that Isidore has, and there are quite a few that Damascius acknowledges, he's at least living according to the philosophical principles that he upholds. And so I think we have to understand that it's one thing to look at the ideas of these people. It's another thing to look at how well they live up to those ideas. And I think the sources show that some did it better than others. But you're right that, like, when Marinus is talking about how Proclus behaves in the world, it's always reflected through the scale of virtues. And it's always reflected through a balancing of those various aspects of the scale of virtues, so that the more important virtues are getting more attention. And so the true philosopher who is behaving admirably in the mind of whoever it is who's writing about them is the person who not only has an understanding of those virtues, but is able to manifest those virtues in the real world in a way that's in accordance with the teaching. And the real problem is, if you are someone like Damascius acknowledges that there are people who just don't understand those virtues. Their mind, their soul does not progress to a level where they have a full understanding of all of the Platonic virtues, and they fail just because they're not capable of completely understanding all the things a philosopher needs to do. This is not the case with Ammonius. What Damascius says quite clearly is Ammonius had that mastery, but he didn't live according to the things that he understood to be the true virtues that a philosopher needed to manifest. And so I think that's really where we're kind of running into. We can evaluate the philosophers for their ideas, but the reality of how they lived and how those ideas impacted their behaviors is also something that contemporaries were very much not only capable of noting, but they saw it as a qualifying or disqualifying aspect of how that philosopher practiced. And practice, I mean, we know, and we've known for a long time, practice matters. You can be theoretically quite astute, but if you don't live according to it, this is not actually living philosophically. You're just saying the words, you're not living the life. And this is what I think these sources are really emphasizing. They aren't concerned with like the physical so much as they're concerned with the manifestation of the virtues that the philosopher needs to understand and bring to bear in the world.
And Professor,
thank you very much.
Yeah. Professor Griffin, Michael.
I'm happy to ask, but we might be out of time too. I could always follow up by email. Maybe that's, we've had so much good stuff to talk about.
We can be flexible. I don't think there are other questions, so please go ahead.
Well, if Edward doesn't mind, thank you so much, Edward, for the wonderful talk, and thank you, Irini, and colleagues for organizing this. I think my question was partly just answered anyway, but it was really about how we should think about the Neoplatonists thematizing this not being a jerk as a virtue, and whether political virtue, sort of politicae arete, is the right place to look at the scale of virtues in the biographies. It sort of sounds like maybe it is. And within that, whether there's any sort of keywords to track. I was thinking about Porphyry's talking about the gentleness of Plotinus, as you were stressing that the Helios, or however he talks about it, that whether that is sort of a virtue to look for. And I was thinking of Olympiodorus describing Plato in contrast to Socrates and Pythagoras. I think Plato as being polykoteron somehow, more, I don't know how we translate that, more sociable, not as kind of, solemn as Pythagoras, but not quite as busy in the agora as Socrates. So would that sort of being polykoteron be something to look for? But yeah, that was it really, just kind of what to look for to thematize that aspect in the scale of virtues. And I think you just spoke to that already too. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And it in a way gets back to Anne's question as well. This question of like, what is the trigger, right? What do we actually see here? I think it is mainly in the context of political virtues, but I don't think it's exclusively in the context of political virtues, because I think there are ways in which you see people who say the words for higher virtues, but don't manifest them. And that I think is the real problem. I think that's what these people are really, really concerned about. Because if you can't live according to what you're teaching, what meaning is there to what you're teaching? And is it viable? I mean, that's I think also a legitimate question. I think that finding a word that sort of marks this is a challenge when you move into the 6th century, because you're moving into a different sort of text, right? You with the biographies, you may well have a consistent vocabulary. And you may well have, they do strongly focus on political virtues and their manifestations. And Marinus' text is so clumsy that in a sense it provides a wonderful roadmap, because he's so transparent in what he's doing, that it provides us, I think, with tools where we can kind of reverse engineer some of what the others are doing. But once you get into the commentary tradition, one of the things that I've found really enjoyable, but also really challenging, is with the commentary tradition, you get these throwaway biographical references. They don't appear regularly. They don't appear in a consistent way. Sometimes they reference something that is like deeply profound, like again in the Gorgias commentary, where there's a reference to like whether you should admonish someone who's behaving in a way that's evil. And what and that relates. You have a saying of Ammonius that relates to a saying of Proclus that you can place back. I don't remember the exact context, but probably Professor Tarrant can. But reflects directly back to a philosophical principle that you can then sort of plug into a set of philosophical virtues. But it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes you just have a throwaway where you can get a sense of a relationship or a sense of a behavior. And so it becomes very difficult in the 6th century to map these things in the way that you would suggest, and maybe that I think you could perhaps do when you're looking at a biographical text, where they are in a sense working off of a noticeable structure that corresponds to a scale of virtues. And you do have a kind of decoder ring in the really clumsy life of Proclus, where you can kind of watch how someone at least would conceive of these things fitting together. So I mean, that's a terrible text for its literary quality, but it's a wonderful, wonderful text for our purposes.
Thank you.
So thank you. I think it looks like we have really run out of time now. So let us thank Ed once again for a very inspirational talk, and thank you all for the lively and very rich discussion. Let us also renew the appointment for the 22nd of March. I hope to see you all again, and for Professor Dillon's talk on the Plotinian Athens narrative. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was really wonderful. It's so great to see everyone.